Hi, everybody. Do you hear me okay? Yes? Good. Thank you. I have this tiny topic to talk about matter and time. And so I will start by saying a few words about being a scientist. So I've found lately especially that it oftentimes takes some explanation as to why I care about science. It's sort of like when you tell people I like chocolate, everything is good, but then you say I like dark chocolate, and all of a sudden it is somehow surprising and you have to give reasons why you like it. So for me, science is a way to enhance the world that I live in. So I can by applying thought about things that are underneath what my eyes see, I feel that my universe is enriched. So since I'm a city kid, one person once told me to go and see this specific park, and I went to that park really early in the morning, and I sat under the trees, and the light was just coming through the leaves. It was early summer, everything was gorgeous, and I was just feeling how those leaves do photosynthesis. And it made me weep. And I really love it. I mean, the whole thing is beautiful to me. The greenery, the leaves, the breeze, the smell, the early morning, everything, plus the photosynthesis, it did not reduce my appreciation, but it enhanced my appreciation of what was around me. So naturally, that person asked me, did you go to the park? I said, yes, I could feel the photosynthesis. And he says, were you drunk? And I was like, no, it was 7 in the morning. That I don't do that, or at least not yet. So then, when did I start to like science? Was in the chemistry classes I did in grade school. So we had a really wonderful chemistry teacher, and we had what was called chemistry section, but I think it would be called club here. And I have gone there, and I really like to learn about chemical elements. And what fascinated me was that there are actually so few chemical elements. And here I want to take us a few steps back. Most often in this room, when we say the word elements, we are talking about the 4 elements that return to their nature as a child to its mother, meaning fire, earth, water, and air. But what I'm talking about are chemical elements that are shown in a periodic table. The periodic table has 7 rows and 18 columns. And each one of the chemical elements is more of a concept than anything concrete, because what we are talking about concrete are atoms. So each chemical element is represented by its atoms. Each atom is a separate physical entity, whereas the chemical element is a concept, just as human being is a concept, and each one of us is entirely different, obviously. So where am I going with this? I am trying to, there are 2 things in which a periodic table of elements is important. So elements are arranged based on how many neutrons and protons they have in the atomic nucleus and how many electrons there are in the electron cloud. And the most important are the numbers of neutrons and protons in the atomic nucleus. And one thing that we most often, those numbers are, we believe, set. And usually when we think about chemistry, we think about set atoms with set numbers. But the fact is, as we go further through the periodic table, as we get to the rows, already row 4, and then row 5, especially 6 and 7, we come to the area where almost every atom is radioactive, which means that their atomic nuclei are unstable and they are falling apart. And as they fall apart, they emit energy. And depending on a type of radionuclide, and radionuclides are chemical elements that are emitting radiation, every radionuclide has its own energy that it emits. But other thing that in my opinion is far cooler still is the fact that that decay happens at a specific rate. So the so-called half-life of chemical element, I'm going to read, is the length of time it takes for 1/2 of the radioactive atoms of a specific radionuclide to decay. So if we have a banana has potassium, and certain amount of that potassium is potassium-40, which is radioactive. It is a very teeny dose. You would need to eat 50 million bananas in order to die from that potassium. You probably die much before you reach the lethal dose. I expect I would not want to be force-fed 50 million bananas in one day. But anyways, so when we think about that banana, the period of time during which 1/2 of potassium atoms that are in that banana have decayed from potassium-40 into calcium-40 and argon-40, that period of time is specific only to potassium-40, and it has a specific length of time, which is rather long, and I've forgotten to write it down, so I apologize for that. But one thing that is neat is, for example, in the rocks, in the soil, there is also potassium, and when that potassium becomes argon, that is then the origin of argon atoms in the soil. Argon is otherwise gas, and it would not be present in rocks if it wasn't actually there originally as potassium that has decayed. Anyways, so matter has ingrained property of time in it. So the universe that we inhabit is not only material, but it is also time-bound because it is material. And I think that that is really, really wonderful. And so here I had put, I had opened a picture that will be in one of the papers that will be published where I was in, and I don't know whether you can see it. It is a decay chain for radium. So radium is always radioactive, and there are a couple of different forms, and they decay with different lengths of time, and I do have the numbers here. So radium 226 decays over 1,602 years, whereas 224 decays over only 3.6 days. Now, regardless of that, radium always decays, and when it decays, it becomes radon gas, and then radon further decays and becomes polonium. So radium becomes radon, and radon becomes polonium, and so become to Dogen naturally. So firewood turns into ash and does not turn into firewood again. But do not suppose that the ash is after and the firewood before. And to me, this is totally congruent with the decay, because when we have radium, we have radium. When it becomes radon, it is radon. They are entirely different. And the difference between one and the other is loss of energy. Firewood likewise loses energy through the process of combustion. So I believe that then Buddhist thought, especially Dogen's passion for time, is really a beautiful, shall we call it, I don't know, pre-visioning of something that has later become learned and realized through science. So just as the word atom that we use comes from the Greeks, they believe that matter has small particles, blah, 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 and those smallest indivisible particles were called atoms. And so then when physics came to and chemistry came to atoms, they used the word that was invented by the Greeks. However, with the time, we understood time much before, and before we knew about the half-life, although obviously nobody knew about radioactive decay at the time of Dogen. And so his understanding of transitions and time that goes from one transition to the other is something that is quite interesting, and I hope that somebody will try to use it for some scientific definition eventually. So then I have now introduced this concept of matter and time, which is the title of my talk, but I want to go back to the periodic table of elements in another sort of reason. Well, actually, I think I mentioned that already. The reason why I got attracted to chemistry is because we are made of so few chemical elements. So I mentioned how the periodic table of elements has 7 rows, and the rows on the top have fewer elements, and as we go down, there are more and more elements in each row. So all the life on Earth is made pretty much only of the top 4 rows. And the reason for that is because those elements are largely stable, and if there are some radioactive elements there, like potassium, they're few and far between. Really, potassium is the only main one. And so our bones are made of calcium, our blood is made with some iron, but by and large, we are carbon-based life forms, carbon, sulfur, phosphor, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen. Those very light elements are what makes our bodies. And also bodies of all the living beings. And then when we go later to rocks and so on, we get into some of these heavier elements. So the complexity of existence on planet Earth can all be ultimately reduced to a handful of these chemical elements. And I find that deeply fascinating and deeply moving. And the way how things are organized then is these atoms are binding to each other through chemical bonds. And then from chemical bonds, we get smaller molecules, and then smaller molecules make bigger molecules, and they make even bigger molecules. And then at some point of time, the chemical evolution occurred on this planet where the Earth sort of yielded sufficient number of macromolecules that can then get organized into something that would later reproduce itself in a more or less, shall we call it, repeatable pattern, and then that became biological life. And so now from chemical macromolecules, we now have biological macromolecules, we have living cells, we have living organisms, we have multicellular organisms, and we have obviously humans and everything else that is around us and that we can see or that we do not see, like the bacteria that are all making a huge amount of our body mass and without which we could not digest our food and so on. So, so why is it that not the entire periodic table is being used for living beings? Why is it the only mostly non-radioactive elements that are being used? Well, the reason for that is that radiant energy that is being emitted when an atom passes from one state to another, that energy is high enough that it can disrupt the chemical bonds. And by disrupting that, like first next level of organization, so first we have atoms, then we have molecules, then we have cells, then we have human beings. If we disrupt the chemical bonds, we disrupt other stuff, we disrupt our bodies at a very low level of organization, and that then has huge ramifications for the health of our cells and for health of us as human beings. So that is one of the reasons why we do not have high deposition of radioactive elements in our bodies. We just could not thrive because we would fall apart. So it is not impossible that certain forms of life actually did include, I don't know, uranium or radium or something like that, but the thing is they could not thrive, and so chemical evolution sort of gave up on that and continued in other directions. And so when we talk about, when we go back to sci-fi movies and so talk about carbon-based life forms, that is because carbon-based life forms depend on chemistry that is incompatible with radioactive decay. So again, why is that something that I am specifically talking to you about this morning? Well, I am a radiation biologist, so I am actually committed to study biology in that specific small boutique sphere, if you will, of intersection between chemistry, physics, and biology. I like to study the effects of radiation on living beings. And the reasons for that are numerous. I mean, first of all, there are bananas always to look out for, and potassium-14, but really I do not want you to get scared of bananas. Please eat them. Potassium is necessary, and you cannot avoid some potassium-40, which will decay. It's really not a big deal. And I have here a Department of Energy, if you still are okay with that, a table that gives you, how much dose you get if you try from LA to New York, and what is the dose EPA limit for drinking water, and so on. But then here on the top, you have the doses. So these are the doses that are natural, sort of a natural background. On the top are doses that you get when you get radiation therapy. And radiation therapy is an extremely powerful way for us to treat cancer and some other diseases as well. And the reason to study effects of radiation on biological matter is to try to make radiation more deadly to cancer cells and less dangerous for healthy cells. So I am constantly on the lookout for chemical materials that will potentiate one, suppress the other, radioprotectors, radiosensitizers. All of those things are subject of my study. But when I'm talking about that, I'm most often talking about the radiation that we receive as external beam radiation therapy, such as X-rays and gamma rays, where we use specific sources. The patient gets strapped in a specific position and receives a dose where, where the radiation goes to a specific spot on the body. But one other type of radiation therapy that is even more interesting and that is sometimes used is when you have a radioactive element, a radionuclide, but you attach it to something that will target only a specific type of cell. And so, such as an antibody, and the antibody then circles to your bloodstream and it finds the specific cell that is evil cell, and then it that radioactive element that is there then spends more time sitting close to the evil cell, and it kills the evil cell, so then you may have a cure of cancer or something else. But then I'm also interested in the effects of radionuclides. And why are radionuclides important? These are the radioactive elements that are present in our environment, that are present all around us. They are becoming more and more present with different sorts of experiments that we are doing, or energy energy development efforts that we have, and different sorts of weapons that we are developing. So, for example, if you bore a hole in the ice, and you can sort of, you can find a layer of ice in the Arctic where you start to see the first uranium, the first plutonium, because that coincides with the time when Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing occurred. We will find other radionuclides after that. There was explosion of Chernobyl, there was explosion of Fukushima. I was really amused to see, to hear from Sensei that she had purchased a stock of kelp from Japan from before Fukushima, after the explosion happened. From California, sorry. But in any event, it is the same Pacific Ocean, so the stuff that comes from Fukushima has spread everywhere. I've done the very same thing after Chernobyl exploded. Serbia, where I lived at the time, is not that far from Ukraine, and I rushed to the store and I bought all the frozen vegetables that I could and all the milk that I could, and I froze that to use. I had a son who was only 3 years old, and radioactive elements are more dangerous the younger you are. You know, I wanted to make sure that I have food that is not radioactively contaminated for as long as possible. So we are living, it is just part of our current life, we are living in a world where there is radioactive pollution. And we are living in a world where we really do need energy. And the fact is that even though radiation is so dangerous, coal pollution, hydroelectric power plants, all of those are not naive, and they also damage our environment tremendously. So we could actually possibly come up with nuclear power plants that are not as dangerous if we were to say, okay, this is dangerous, we can do this better, and make sure that this does not get polluted and so on. And I've heard that that there is even a Buddhist thinker who thought that we should, and I forget the name, maybe you remember, I don't know. No, it is an American woman who has proposed that maybe we should put radioactive waste into stupas, and be sure that we see them and give them certain reverence as a potential source of harm to our planet and everything around us. So now back to time though. So in all my studies of the effects of radiation on biological systems, I have not seen anything that is unique to radiation. And this is something that is quite bizarre. So if you are into exposing yourself to sun and you like UV radiation, and you get certain mutations that later lead to cancer and so on, you will see that those mutations are always between certain nucleotides. It is always thymine or cytidine, or they are pyrimidine dimers. If you are exposed to platinum, you will have certain other types of mutations. If you have been exposed to, I don't know, chemotherapy drugs of a specific type, you will have specific types of mutations. However, if you're exposed to radiation, actually there is no signature mutation. People are still looking for it. There are no signature mutations. What happens is pretty much the same type of mutations that you get with aging, with the process of passage of time. So this extra energy that gets deposited to our bodies translates somehow into aging of the biological material. So biological aging is tightly linked with energy, and especially energy of radiation. And that is something that I find, again, really important thing to consider and to try to wrap our mind around. And so, so really what I would then like us to ponder at this point of time is that we are indeed in a universe where we are interdependent, in the universe of causes and conditions and interdependence, where we cannot say that we exist independently of anything else, where everything else is impacted by us, and also where things that are also interconnected at these different physical, organizational levels. So atoms depend on other atoms, molecules depend on other molecules, and so on. So we have these different organizational levels when we think about our bodies going sort of down by levels of complexity. So if we reduce our body to atoms alone, we are, each one of us, worth about $12, because these chemical elements that we are made of are cheap, cheap elements. So, you know, phosphorus, sulfur, you know, get some fertilizer, whatever, it's all quite cheap. I guess maybe if you're buying expensive bottled water, you can up the price, but you know, if you're using tap water, we are quite inexpensive. Nevertheless, obviously, we are quite important to ourselves and to others. So those levels of organization that are underneath our bodily level organization, we are oftentimes not thinking about. And yet we should, because that too is part of interdependence and part of this material universe. And material universe is all that we have as within the relative, that is where we abide. So in terms of organization, then, what we have above us are our social structures, our cultural structures, our states, so on. So those are the areas of life that we are oftentimes discussing when we are hearing Dharma talks. We are listening about the fact that it is important to know that we cannot control things that are other than ourselves. So clearly we can make impact on others only through ourselves. We have to start with ourselves if we want to make societal changes, cultural changes. So we have to know, if you will, where our place is. We cannot just go and change things in this relative universe based on our desires and designs when we think about organizational levels that are above us. But it is just as true that we cannot make any difference at the organizational levels that are below us. So we are really indeed that interface between an air bubble and a water container that it is sitting in. The sphere of our consciousness, of our mind, which is impossible to grasp. Thank you all for indulging my love of Dogen. Yeah, so the sphere of our mind is something that is really impossible to grasp because it is sitting on top of something that we have no control over and below something that we have no control over. So really, our control levels are infinitesimally tiny, and we should be aware of that. And I think that being aware of scientific truths can help us get there a little bit. Well, in my opinion, at least it is more fun, but I don't know. I think that we can be more honest, and perhaps it is easier to accept that we cannot change, you know, people who we care about or behavior of our pets because we want to. Just as we cannot choose which potassium we will ingest when we eat a banana, you know, whether it will be potassium 40 or the ones that are not radioactive. We have no choice over almost anything in our lives, and we have to accept that, and it is still okay. I mean, and it is, you know, really cool to be alive. So I guess I have covered most of what I wanted to say, and I have made it to half hour, which is what Chris told me I should try to make. So I will stop here and I will take any questions and I will discuss anything you want to say. Thank you, thank you, thank you, everybody.
Tanya, this is such a great topic. It expanded my knowledge of
You can take your mask off when you're asking the questions so we can hear you better.
All right. Tanya, thank you so much for this talk. It was really wonderful, and I learned a lot more about research and what's behind it. And I think it kind of led me to think about how radiology can be used in positive and negative ways, just like religion. Like religion can be used in, non-positive ways for people, and it can be the energy for spiritual lifting. So it's kind of interesting. And I don't know, that's just a comment, and you can elaborate.
I really think that everything is like that. Everything in life can be both good and bad. It all depends on quantities and so on. So, yeah. Yes, balance and the middle way.
So, some of that went over my head, Tanya.
Thank you, Roshi. I knew you would be honest. And that's what I want.
So I do have a question about time. Mm-hmm. So you said that the elements that are below the fourth row that are unstable all mm-hmm. have half-lives. Mm-hmm. Do the elements above them have anything like a half-life? They don't, because they don't disappear or they don't disintegrate, so they don't.
They are considered stable, but they too will decay in a very, very slow period of time.
So when you say that decay rate is the half-life of mm-hmm. the unstable elements is the same for each one, has its own mm-hmm. half-life, yes. And it doesn't change.
That doesn't change, yes.
So that is it. So how does that? I have a question about time. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that as the culture becomes more complex, that the rate of change that time can change, that time could speed up? But in your model, it sounds like that's not a view of science, but from my humble point of view as a human being mm-hmm. who often feels overwhelmed mm-hmm. by the things going on in my culture, which seem to be getting more complex, my subjective experience of time mm-hmm. Feels like it's not just a unit. It actually, the rate of the time could speed up or it could slow down. And I experienced that in meditation as well. When we're in a deeper, towards the end of the retreat, you notice that the meditation periods speed up. They don't take as long, and that's because you're in the place of samadhi. So you experience time as moving faster. And I wonder how you would view that from the point of view of your science.
So the way how I view that is similar to how I view sort of material existence, if you will. So just as we know that there are 5 skandhas, etc., and we have no say over what they are, and we have no say over how they function. So this sort of time that is ingrained in matter through radioactive decay and through other time matter-related processes, that time is something that we do not have any say over and we have no awareness of. So the time that we perceive is, I'm going to use probably a bad word, a simulacrum, if you will. A simulacrum is like, it is our deluded perception of, our understanding of time is inherently deluded, just as our understanding of matter is inherently deluded. This table is different to me than the floor because I have my feet on one and my iPad on the other. But, you know, if this was, I don't know, if this was a hologram of a table, I wouldn't care about it. I am going back to Namarupa, which is a concept that I adore. So when the objects are named, they're useful to us. And when we do not know what they are irrelevant to us. So that is our attitude towards material world. Our attitude with time is we have no clue about the time that is ingrained within matter, and we do not care. So the only thing that we care is our perception of time and our perception of matter and our subjective self that we are living within. So, and I think that that is wonderful and, you know, and great as it is.
Okay, I'm still not quite satisfied. It seems to me that you're talking about matter as, or time as something that's outside of, that if my perception of time is just a delusion because it's subjective. But what's the line between subjective and objective? It sounds like you're talking about an objective world out there. Mm-hmm. But where is time? Is it out there, or is it in here? Or is there if my subjective experience of time is delusional, then you're implying that there's a time that is outside of my experience that is more true. And that's curious to me.
Well, for me, that seems to be kind of so both for time and for matter. So there are, shall we call them material representations of both, as they are, as the ingredients that make us. But then when we are a higher organizational level, and at our organizational level, there are also truths, but Dogen would have called those delusions. But we have to be a fish that is swimming in the water or bird that is flying in the sky. We have to be inside our element or element, however you want to call it. So we are where we are, and we have to have experience that we have, which doesn't mean that there is not something else. But it also doesn't mean that that in the material universe there are things that are not outside of our domain physically. So the idea of the world being born with me and the world dying with me, I see that as true. But I also see the idea of world existing other than through me and continuing to exist after me. That too is true, and I find great comfort in that.
Does anybody online have anything that they'd like to ask or comment on?
I will. Good morning, Tanya. Wonderful. Shishan here. I studied Dogen with you, and I kept thinking about Uji being time, and I kept thinking about Dogen saying, so in essence, we can think about the past, and when we think about the past, we can think about the past, in the future, and in the present. We can think about each of the past, present, and futures that way. And in fact, there are 10, because it's all one. And so I'm still trying to grasp Roshi's questions. And I think that really, it's just all one, Roshi. Time is subjective and objective at the same time. It's kind of what,
But I think that Roshi wanted to say that both are in the realm of relative, which I think is still also completely true, and you agree with that. And
I do agree with that. I think it's totally in the relative and in the objective. It's all one,
well, yeah.
both. Thank you. This is really interesting. I've struggled with the periodic table since I almost failed chemistry. So now I appreciate it even more.
Hi, this is my first time coming to the center, and so, oh, thank you. Yeah, so this is a very pleasant surprise, because I had no idea that this was going to be such an intense and intellectual conversation. But I don't know if I actually have a question or a comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. But I feel, you know, I'm Japanese American, and so I have studied and thought a lot about, you know, the dropping of nuclear weapons on Japan and our continued use of nuclear energy. And I appreciate so much that you are thinking about, you know, the possibilities of radiation in a positive way. But I guess like what I was really intrigued and somewhat surprised by is you talking about how little we can control anything, right? That the reality is, and what you learn from your studying is that there's so much that is completely out of our control, and there's so much that we need to accept. And yet I think, like, paradoxically, I think we also live in a world where we are really seeing that the choices that we make as individuals and as a society can have, you know, terrible and lasting impact. And so I guess I would love to hear you talk a little about just about that paradox, right? Like that actually there's nothing in our control, and yet at the same time, there's so much in our control.
Yes. Okay, so what we do control is really our own behavior, and that is, of course, a topic that is, you know, can be discussed at tremendous levels. And what we say and do within society, without what we say and do in our families, in the world as a whole, has tremendous impact on the planet, on each other, and the fact is we can actually lead to degradation of things that exist in terms of their organizational level. So that is just sort of physical impact, if you will. And you know, when you mention dropping of the bombs in Japan, as a radiation biologist, I've traveled to Japan for work, and I have visited museums, I have visited places where epicenter was, and so on. And that is that sort of a horror of human stupidity is something that will never stop to make me be upset. But I do believe that we should have the wisdom to do better. You know, how do I put it? If we are able to communicate, if we have language, if Dogen had a vision to know about radioactive decay or not, and write about that, and if we are able to read about that today, that too is a result of culture and society. So we should be able to do good things just as we are able to do bad things. And in the end, it's all a matter of degrees of how we will do things. So, you know, But again, you know, a word, 2 words can make a difference. Back to the bombing of Japan, Hiroshima bomb was always meant to be Hiroshima, but I don't know if you know that Nagasaki bomb was actually meant to be Kyoto. And somebody in a conference when that was being decided said, please don't do that. And, you know, and yet when you go to Nagasaki, it feels bad. So, yeah.
So Tanya, maybe I misunderstood, but I heard you saying, or at least suggesting the possibility that there would be safe nuclear energy.
I do believe that that is not impossible. I think that we are cheap, though.
But if you're dealing with unstable radioactive material, then how can you be confident that you can have control over it when in fact we have so little control? Why not use energy, renewable energy systems that are more stable? Because I'm sure when they built Fukushima, they engineered it and thought they had had it all in control, and yet there were extreme weather events that they didn't anticipate that brought the whole thing down.
Well, Fukushima is one of the really ancient power plants, and it should have been decommissioned long time ago. And what is going on right now in Europe with the nuclear power plant scare, it scares the living hell out of me, because what's going on is countries that had built nuclear power plants recently, such as Germany, they are shutting those down, but they still do need electricity, and they have not come up with sustainable ways of producing electricity. So they imported from Krško, which is a crappy old power plant in Slovenia, former Yugoslavia, which was one of the first ones, and that has occasionally leaked stuff into the environment. And so what will happen is rich will get their energy from nuclear power plants or from coal electrical power plants that are in different parts of the world. Coal pollution is horrific. Here in Chicago, if you go to Calumet River, I mean, the how is it called? Coal peat dust or something like that. The contamination is horrible. But who lives there? Chicagoans whose annual income is $30,000 a year. And so, you know, they are experiencing that. And do we care? We don't. You know, are we shutting off the lights? We are not shutting off the lights when we go to, you know, shop, and then we will come back soon. I am guilty of it myself. So we need to have different attitude towards consumption of energy, towards production of energy. And so far we have managed to put coal peat dust in Calumet River, but sooner or later it's going to be on you know,
I'm not going to argue with you that coal is destructive to the environment as well, and China is very polluted, but I'm still concerned the idea that we could do nuclear power in a safe way. There's also a political problem around that because there's so much secrecy. I believe the Japanese government passed a law sometime after Fukushima that journalists couldn't talk about it. I mean, there's a lot of secrecy around nuclear power and how it's done, which means it's very hard for there to be any accountability.
Yes.
And that's...
Yes, I think that we have made a mess and out of our planet, and you know, hopefully, I mean, not hopefully, planet will survive us, but yeah, how it's going to look like, I do not know.
I just love the fact that you're researching. This is your what you are interested in, and you're applying it for healing purposes and studying the body. So. And it's fascinating. I think if I understood you right, you said because we have small radioactive elements in the body, that's what is contributing to our aging.
Possibly.
Possibly.
Possibly. possibly, but it could be also other sources of energy just gradually accumulating and, sort of.
But energy is released as radioactive elements decay.
Yes, but there are also other types of energy, chemical energy of chemical reactions that we function on. And that also is sort of wearing our bodies down very gradually with time. I don't know, like currently accepted idea is that we die ultimately because our mitochondria, which are producing energy for the body, cannot function anymore and they just start to fall apart. So we get what is called metabolic syndromes sooner or later, where we just.
Tanya, thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful talk. And I just loved your last description about the bubbles and the different universes that there's no way that we can understand. To me, that was such a great little concise description of not knowing and why not knowing is such an important practice.
Thank you for tying that. I wish I said it.
Thank you, Tanya, for the wonderful talk. I just really a comment that I just feel like always just so spiritually enriched after whenever I get the opportunity to understand science or the inner workings of how our world works. I think I kind of agree with your sentiment that just the more we understand science, just what a beautiful appreciation for how our world works. So thank you. I'd love to hear you talk again more about this.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I guess that is it for our Sunday Morning Zen program. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we also so thankful for your practice, for your zazen or your meditation practice. It helps you, it helps me, it helps everyone, right? We're all connected. So thank you very much, Tanya. Michael, any final words?
No, thank you all for attending, and thank you so much, Tanya, for that wonderful talk.